The phone rang 3 times before Marcus the Wolf Romano picked up. September 18th, 1956, 2:47 a.m. Marcus was the kind of man who answered calls at any hour, when the right people called, and Vito Genovese was definitely the right people. "It's time." Vito's voice cut through the static. "Johnson's getting too comfortable, too powerful, too independent." Marcus understood. Independence was a luxury the mob didn't allow, especially not from someone operating in their territory, even if that someone was Bumpy Johnson, the undisputed king of Harlem. "What's the number?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer would be substantial. $100,000, dead or alive, but I prefer alive. I want to look him in the eyes when he realizes his kingdom is gone. The line went dead. Marcus stared at the receiver for a long moment. $100,000 was serious money in 1956. Serious enough to buy entire city blocks. Serious enough to make men forget their fear. And everyone in New York's underworld feared Bumpy Johnson. But what Vito Genovese didn't understand was that putting a bounty on Bumpy Johnson wasn't like putting a bounty on anyone else. Bumpy didn't just survive by being smart or ruthless. He survived by understanding the difference between controlling territory and owning it. By 6 a.m. that morning, word of the bounty had spread through every corner of the city's criminal underground. The first hunters began moving within hours. Tommy Ice Pick Torino was already on the subway to Harlem by 7 a.m. Tommy had worked for the Genovese family for 12 years, and had never failed to collect a bounty. 3 years earlier, his younger brother had tried to muscle in on a numbers operation in Harlem, and ended up in Bellevue Hospital with 2 broken legs. This bounty was business, but it was also personal. Vincent Carbone was driving north from Philadelphia with 2 associates. Vincent specialized in high-value targets and had connections with corrupt police officers. He'd studied Bumpy's patterns for months, treating every target like a scientific problem to be solved. But the most dangerous hunter was an Italian. Jerome Snake Eyes Washington was a former Harlem enforcer who'd fallen out with Bumpy 2 years earlier. Snake Eyes knew Bumpy's habits, his safe houses, his routes through Harlem. He'd been part of the inner circle, had seen the man behind the legend. What none of these men realized was that Bumpy Johnson had known about the bounty before Vito Genovese had even made the call to Marcus Romano. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive for 25 years through luck or reputation alone. He built an information network that extended far beyond organized crime. He had connections in police precincts, city hall, even the phone company. When Vito Genovese started making inquiries about Bumpy's operation 3 weeks earlier, word had filtered back through channels that most mob bosses never knew existed. September 17, 1955. One day before the bounty was announced, Bumpy was sitting in his office above Dickie Wells' barbershop when Illinois Gordon knocked on the door. Illinois was Bumpy's most trusted lieutenant and strategist. "Boss, we got a problem," Illinois said. "Paulie Torino's been asking questions." Paulie was Tommy Ice Pick's younger brother, a small-time collector who'd been observing Bumpy's movements with unusual interest. "What kind of questions?" Bumpy asked. "Your morning routine, where you eat breakfast, which barber shop you use, where you park your car." Illinois sat down. Paulie's not smart enough to plan something himself, but someone's paying him to gather information. Bumpy understood something that most men in his position never learned. Sometimes the powerful way to use information was to control what your enemies thought they knew. "How much time do we have?" Bumpy asked. "Maybe 24 hours. Maybe less." That's when Bumpy Johnson made a decision that would change everything. Instead of running or hiding, he decided to turn the hunt around. "Illinois, I want you to spread a story," Bumpy said, opening his desk drawer. "Bumpy Johnson is getting scared. The pressure from the Italians is getting to him. He's drinking more, sleeping less, jumping at shadows. Word is he's been talking about leaving New York." The story Illinois told that evening in Harlem's bars was carefully crafted psychological warfare. He seemed reluctant to share information, acting protective while his own confidence appeared to be shaking. The misinformation worked because it played on something the hunters wanted to believe, that Bumpy Johnson was finally showing cracks. By morning, Tommy Ice Pick heard it from a bartender. Vincent Carbone heard it from a numbers runner. Snake Eyes heard it from Willie Johnson, who sold information to whoever paid best. But Willie wasn't selling information. He was delivering it. Every word had been approved by Bumpy himself. The hunters began to close in, but they weren't hunting Bumpy Johnson anymore. They were hunting the version of Bumpy Johnson that Bumpy wanted them to find. September 18th, 8:30 p.m. The Apollo Theater was hosting a show featuring Dinah Washington and Count Basie's orchestra. The theater was packed. The music was loud. And the crowd was distracted. Perfect cover for what Tommy Ice Pick had planned. According to Willie Johnson, Bumpy would be in his usual box seat, the one that gave him a clear view of both the stage and the audience. Tommy had positioned himself in the balcony with a clear sight line. The plan was simple: wait for intermission. When the lights came up and people started moving around, one shot to the head, then disappear in the chaos. Tommy waited through the first act, watching Bumpy through binoculars. The man looked older than Tommy had expected. Grayer. More tired, definitely not the invincible figure from the stories. This was going to be easier than he'd thought. When intermission began and the house lights came up, Tommy made his move. He descended from the balcony, moving through the crowd toward Bumpy's box. His hand was inside his jacket, fingers wrapped around the grip of a .38 special. He was 20 feet away when he realized his mistake. The man in Bumpy's box wasn't Bumpy Johnson. It was Illinois Gordon, wearing one of Bumpy's signature suits and Bumpy's trademark fedora. Illinois saw Tommy approaching, saw the recognition in Tommy's eyes, and smiled. "Looking for someone?" Illinois asked quietly. Tommy tried to draw his weapon, but Illinois was faster. Not with a gun, but with words that cut deeper than any bullet. "Bumpy says thanks for making this so easy." Tommy Ice Pick Torino was found 3 hours later in an alley behind the theater, unconscious but alive. When he woke up, he discovered two things. His weapon was gone, and there was a note pinned to his jacket. The note contained an address and a simple message: "Tomorrow, noon, come alone." The address was for a warehouse in Queens, far from Bumpy's usual territory. Tommy didn't understand why he'd been left alive, didn't understand what the note meant, but he understood enough to be scared. The next morning, Tommy called Marcus Romano. "We got a problem," he said. "Johnson knows about the bounty." "Impossible," Marcus replied. "The only people who know are..." He stopped, because suddenly it wasn't impossible anymore. Vincent Carbone discovered the same truth at the same time, in a very different way. He'd been watching Bumpy's house on Sugar Hill, the elegant brownstone where Bumpy lived with his wife. Vincent had spent 2 days mapping the neighborhood, identifying escape routes, planning the approach. On September 19th at dawn, Vincent saw Bumpy leave the house and walk toward his car, a black Cadillac Eldorado parked at the corner. Bumpy was alone, apparently unaware he was being watched. Vincent decided this was his opportunity. He followed the Cadillac through the streets of Harlem, staying 3 cars back, professional and patient. The car headed downtown, toward the financial district. Strange destination for a Harlem kingpin. But Vincent didn't question it. He was focused on finding the right moment to make his move. The Cadillac pulled into a parking garage on Wall Street. Vincent followed, parking 2 levels up. He waited 15 minutes, then descended to find Bumpy's car. It was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat was a manila envelope with Vincent's name written on it in block letters. Inside the envelope was a photograph of Vincent's wife and 2 children outside their home in Philadelphia. Underneath the photograph was a note: "Beautiful family. It would be a shame if something happened to them while you're in New York chasing shadows." Vincent Carbone was on the highway back to Philadelphia within an hour. He never returned to New York, but Snake Eyes Washington was different. He wasn't afraid of threats, and he wasn't impressed by psychological games. He'd known Bumpy for years, understood how the man thought. Snake Eyes knew that Bumpy was playing some kind of angle, but he also knew Bumpy's weaknesses. The weakness had a name: Mame Hatcher. Bumpy's wife was the one person in the world he couldn't sacrifice, couldn't use as bait, couldn't put at risk. She was his anchor to legitimacy, his connection to the world beyond Harlem's underground, and Snake Eyes knew exactly how to use that against him. September 20th, 10 a.m. Snake Eyes positioned himself outside the beauty salon where Mame Hatcher got her hair done every Tuesday morning. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Grab Mame, use her as leverage to draw Bumpy into the open, then collect the bounty. Snake Eyes waited in his car, watching the salon entrance. At 10:30, a woman emerged who looked like Mame from behind. Same height, same coat, same walk. Snake Eyes followed her 3 blocks before realizing his mistake. The woman wasn't Mame Hatcher. It was a school teacher named Dorothy Williams, who lived in the same neighborhood and happened to own a similar coat. But more importantly, the woman knew she was being followed. When she turned the corner onto 35th Street, she was met by 6 men who'd been waiting for her signal. One of those men was Bumpy Johnson. "Jerome," Bumpy said quietly, using Snake Eyes' real name. "Been a long time." Snake Eyes reached for his weapon, but stopped when he realized he was surrounded. Not by Bumpy's usual enforcers, but by men he recognized from the neighborhood. Shop owners, bartenders, cab drivers, regular people who owed Bumpy favors, or whose families Bumpy had helped over the years. "You made a mistake, Jerome," Bumpy continued. "You forgot that this isn't just my territory. This is my home. These aren't just my employees. They're my neighbors. That's when Snake Eyes Washington understood what had happened. The bounty hadn't made Bumpy vulnerable. It had revealed something that the hunters had forgotten. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal who operated in Harlem. He was part of Harlem's fabric, woven into the community in ways that went far beyond business or fear. The men surrounding Snake Eyes didn't work for Bumpy. They worked with him. Here's what's going to happen, Bumpy said. You're going to walk away. You're going to leave New York. And you're going to spread the word that the hunt is over. What about the bounty? Snake Eyes asked. Bumpy smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. The bounty's been collected. By noon on September 20th, 1956, exactly 48 hours after Vito Genovese had announced the $100,000 bounty on Bumpy Johnson, the hunt was indeed over. But not because Bumpy had been captured or eliminated. It was over because Bumpy Johnson now owned the hunters. Tommy Ice Pick Torino returned to Brooklyn a changed man. He told anyone who would listen that Bumpy Johnson was untouchable, that trying to collect the bounty was suicide. Within a week, he'd left New York permanently. Vincent Carbone never spoke publicly about what happened, but he quietly spread the word through Philadelphia's underworld. Stay away from Harlem, and stay away from Bumpy Johnson. Snake Eyes Washington took Bumpy's advice and disappeared. Some said he went to Detroit, others claimed he moved to Los Angeles. No one knew for certain, and no one cared enough to find out. But the most important transformation was in the perception of power itself. Vito Genovese had expected the bounty to solve his Bumpy Johnson problem. Instead, it revealed that the problem wasn't Bumpy's independence. It was Genovese's fundamental misunderstanding of how power worked in Harlem. The mob's power was based on fear and hierarchy. Orders came from the top. Compliance was enforced through violence. Loyalty was purchased through money or intimidation. It was a structure that worked in neighborhoods where people were isolated, where trust was scarce, where survival meant keeping your head down. But Harlem was different. Harlem was a community, and Bumpy Johnson had spent 25 years becoming part of that community's DNA. When the bounty was announced, Bumpy didn't need to hire bodyguards. The protection came from people who remembered when he'd paid their rent during the Depression, from families whose sons he'd kept out of jail, from business owners whose stores he'd protected. Bumpy had spent 25 years understanding that in Harlem, survival wasn't about domination. It was about integration. The mob saw neighborhoods as territory to be conquered. Bumpy saw Harlem as a community to be served. When police harassed black businesses, Bumpy made calls that stopped it. When landlords exploited tenants, Bumpy applied pressure that changed their behavior. Every favor created a connection. Every act of protection built loyalty. By 1956, attacking Bumpy meant attacking the community itself, and the community had learned to defend itself. Vincent Carbone discovered this when he tried to recruit local informants. Offering cash for information about Bumpy was more likely to get him reported than rewarded. Tommy Ice Pick found himself constantly watched and redirected. Shop owners would claim they were closed. Cab drivers would refuse rides. The hunters weren't fighting one man. They were fighting an entire community that had decided Bumpy Johnson was worth protecting. 2 weeks after the failed hunt, Bumpy Johnson walked into Rao's restaurant in East Harlem. It was a bold move, entering the heart of Italian territory alone and unarmed. But Bumpy understood that sometimes the most powerful statement you could make was to show no fear. He asked to speak with Vito Genovese. The meeting lasted exactly 7 minutes. No one knows what was said, but everyone knows what happened afterward. The bounty was officially withdrawn. Not reduced, not postponed, withdrawn entirely. More importantly, the Genovese family's expansion into Harlem came to a permanent end. The failed hunt taught both sides a valuable lesson about the nature of power. For the mob, it revealed that money and violence weren't enough when you were fighting someone who'd built real relationships with real people. For Bumpy, it confirmed something he'd always known but never tested so directly. True power comes not from what you can take, but from what people willingly give you. The story of the $100,000 bounty became legend in New York's underworld. Not because of the violence. There had been surprisingly little actual violence, but because of what it revealed about leadership, community, and the difference between ruling through fear and governing through respect. The story of the $100,000 bounty became legend in New York's underworld. Not because of violence. There had been surprisingly little, but because of what it revealed about leadership and the difference between ruling through fear and governing through respect. Years later, when young criminals would ask how Bumpy Johnson had maintained his position for so long, they would mention the bounty as a demonstration of how a real leader turns a threat into an opportunity. Tommy Ice Pick Torino found himself questioning his understanding of power itself. Vincent Carbone discovered that all his research had missed the foundation of Bumpy's real strength. Snake Eyes learned that personal knowledge meant nothing without understanding the larger system. Throughout New York's criminal underground, The story became a case study in the difference between authority and influence, between controlling territory and owning it. In 48 hours, Bumpy Johnson had transformed 3 dangerous hunters into unwilling advertisements for his power. He'd reminded the Italian mob that Harlem wasn't just territory to be conquered, it was a community to be respected. He'd proven that real power isn't something you take from others. It's something others give you willingly, and something they'll fight to protect when it's threatened. The hunt was over. But the lesson would last for decades. The $100,000 bounty had failed not because Bumpy Johnson was too smart to catch, but because he'd built something the hunters couldn't understand. A community that saw his success as inseparable from their own.